Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's episode is a special one and my very favorite episode of the year. It's the End of the Year Spectacular, where my pal Brandon Burpee joins to talk about the year that was in comics before we dive into our 20 favorite comics of the year. Brandon, are you ready to make this happen once again?
Oh man, I'm so ready. I wait for this all year long. I've got a spreadsheet, baby.
Okay, this is a random place to start, but what is your process? You do have a spreadsheet that you're just like updating all year, right?
Yep. I'm not caught up with it, but then it's like a matter of just going through the books. Because what I'll do is if an issue is something that I walk away from and I'm like, okay, I really liked that, it goes in the pile.
Mm-hmm.
And then I add that tally to come up with the basic skeleton of my list, which is how many issues for each descending down. And then from there, once I have my 20 built off of how many issues, I reorganize it based on there's a 4-issue miniseries. Obviously, all 4 of those issues make it, then it has to be higher than maybe something like an X-Men where there's 50 million issues a year and 10 of it makes it on my list.
Interesting. So you actually kind of like a tally system where you're actively, it's like you can look at that and be like, all right, 10 of the 12 issues of Stiltman Returns were notched onto my list. And so that means that's going to finish high because you like that book consistently versus 2 of the 12 issues or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. You've come a long way. Wasn't your process before, back in the day in 4-Color Day, basically drawer base where you would put all the stuff in the drawer? I seem to remember there's a drawer involved.
Yeah, I used to have drawers that they were like the file cabinet. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had the file cabinet and it was organized based on not in a bagger slab, in a bagger slab. And then the top one was issues thrown in for the best of whatever for the year.
That's awesome.
Because we'd finish doing the weekly 4-color and do our top 10, and I would just put those into that drawer.
Mm-hmm. That's smart. That's way smarter than I am always with this. I did do an Excel sheet this year, but it was just total BS. It was just a giant list, and then I had to actually face organizing that right before this podcast actually started recording. So I envy you. You're smarter than this. But all right, before we get into the top 20, I want to talk about the year that was. We'll start with you, Brandon, because everyone has heard from me plenty already about what I think about the year. How do you feel like the year in comics has been?
I've really enjoyed this year, honestly. I'm reading a lot of stuff from a lot of different publishers. Other than that, in some... see, it's always tricky because I don't want to give anything away.
I know.
In some categories, I find myself reading more than I would have expected. And then in some regards, it's a lot of the same stuff. You know what I mean? I love my superheroes. There's always going to be superheroes on my list, but there's a multitude this year that maybe didn't exist last year.
When you say categories, do you mean like genres?
Yeah.
It is interesting. I think that's one of the things that is actually really pretty awesome about this period in time. Like when we came up, I started reading in the 90s and the world was pretty much superheroes and then random things that I might be able to find when I go to Bosco's, our then local comic book shop. I started reading Jeff Smith's Bone, when I was really young. And that and Madman were 2 of the only comics I could find that were not superhero comics. And even Madman was kind of superhero related. And it is interesting because if you decide you like horror comics or if you like action comics or whatever, not literally the action comics title, but comics that are action packed or whatever, you really can find anything these days. And I think that makes it a much more interesting medium to read.
Yeah, I would agree. Because sometimes, as much as I love my superheroes, you read the same stuff over and over again, and it's nice to get a little variety. And there's not always something that sticks out to me that's not, superheroes or Ninja Turtles or my go-tos. But this year there was a lot of variety.
You like what you like.
Yeah.
Bizarrely, I find that I like kind of bittersweet comics a lot. I find myself attracted to stuff that's I once described it to a creator who was I hadn't noticed you like this, very sarcastically, because he had noticed things that are 20% sad. I don't know what that says about me, Brandon. I might be 20% sad all the time, I guess.
You just put on some emo music and sit there and read.
Oh my God. A friend of mine, I made her some mixes back when we were in college, and one of them had the early November on it. And I was just, I don't know if you've ever listened
Yes.
to, if you've listened to the early November since then. And that was a very moment in time band. I listen to it now and I'm just like, I can't connect with this. I am not that emotional anymore. I had a patron question about our reading habits from Scott Hazelwood. He was wondering how we feel about the year in quote unquote satisfying chunks and like how we're reading. He said, are you seeing more titles that are satisfying on an issue by issue basis? Are you considering more trade weighting? Is it all pretty much the same? Where are you at with reading right now?
Reading right now, I read in chunks.
You're a binger?
I'm a binger. Yeah, I'm definitely more of a binger. Sometimes wait for trades, wait till it's all done, collect it up and read it. I have a short attention span, so if I read monthly, sometimes I don't remember what the hell happened 2 months ago or a month ago. So it's easier for me to read in chunks and also to read in trade paperback, just collected editions. So that's kind of how my reading habits have gone and evolved.
I am with you in a lot of ways because I'm not going to name what this comic was, but there was a comic that I accidentally read out of order this year, and it did not seem less confusing that way. And at that moment, I was like, I either need to change how I'm reading this comic or I need to stop reading this comic because clearly it's not making a big difference to my reading habits that I read it completely out of order. I don't know if that says more about me or the comic, but sometimes that happens. I do find, so I always try to like read as much as humanly possible. And normally I start reading in like kind of late September, roughly right around then, in terms of like the things that I've kind of missed, the things that people are talking about and stuff that are like great comics. I started earlier this year because it was a huge pain to try to read dozens and dozens of graphic novels in a really tight period. I think if I have a goal for next year, it's to start when the comics actually come out rather than trying to read like 90 graphic novels in 3 months. That is a lot. It's a lot, Brandon.
Yeah, that sounds like it. That's crazy.
There's binging and then there's overdoing it. And I think I've overdone it to some degree this year.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I know that we talked about this already. One of the funny things is like this preamble part is always like filled with possible spoilers for our lists. And we're trying to avoid that as much as possible. I am curious though, were there any larger ideas that stood out to you in the year that was, whether it was like a line of comics or relaunches or anything like that? Was there anything that seemed really interesting to you as a reader as like a way to draw your attention?
Yeah, I thought there was a couple like universes that were launched that I thought kind of excited me, like the Energon universe. That really picked up this year and that was enjoyable. You've got G.I. Joe coming into that with Transformers, you got Void Rivals. So the expanded universe there was really cool. Also, a lot of the stuff Jeff Johns is doing at Image. Ghost Machine, right?
Yeah, Ghost Machine.
That whole label and brand, I've enjoyed a lot of the books on that list. So I think that's kind of what stood out to me is the newer stuff this year that came out that really attracted me as opposed to some of my run-of-the-mill stuff that I'm used to.
Your usual favorites.
My usual favorites, X-Men.
I will say that is one thing that I think is really interesting about those kind of little universes. I call them micro lines, and like Energon and Ultimate and Absolute and Ghost Machine and stuff like that.
Ultimate too, you're right.
The nice thing about those is it kind of, I don't know, like sometimes when I look at like, let's say Marvel or DC, and I look at like 40 to 60 comics that they release every single month or whatever it is, I don't really know what I want to read and like what will feel like it's kind of a cohesive unit. And I like that if you read those, you kind of just get like a universe in this like tight little group. And it makes it a little bit more, I don't know, fun and engaging to me as a reader.
Yeah, it brings back like that initial fun of like exploring like Batman or X-Men comics as a kid, like learning this environment and learning that all these characters are connected and how they're connected. And I think that's just like a nostalgic thing that'll always kick in with me when it comes to stuff like that. Just that ability to reconnect with that mystery.
Oh my God, I've never made this connection before, but I just realized that in some ways, so like Absolute DC, that's another one that's happening with like Absolute Batman, Absolute Wonder Woman, Absolute Superman, etc. And like the whole idea is that in this universe, Dark Side won. I just realized, what's the difference between that and Age of Apocalypse?
Not much.
Not much. I never
Not
really,
much.
It's funny though, because it's like, what if this villain won? How does that change these characters? Wolverine doesn't have a hand. That's it. Batman's big. There we go. And it is kind of funny. I actually had not connected that before, but I like those because, like, I mean, Age of Apocalypse, I hate to like really boil my fandom for the X-Men down to something that came out 30 years ago or whatever. But Age of Apocalypse, that was in a lot of ways the most I ever loved comics because it was just so mind blowing to me. But at the same time, I also was just like, I know I just have to read Amazing X-Men and Gambit and the Externals or whatever. And that was it. Like, I just read these comics versus like sometimes it can just be a little overwhelming trying to figure out what I should read. And so I like that those universes make it a little easier on me, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a little more digestible.
Yeah. Okay. This is not, you don't have to name specific books, but I'm curious, do you feel like one of the big two has an advantage right now for you as a reader?
One of the two.
Are you going to consult your list right now?
Yeah, I'm looking at my list real quick. Yeah, I would say.
Do you not want to say because you don't want to spoil your list?
Yeah, it's hard to answer because there's more of one, but the quality of what makes it from the other is better.
I actually know exactly what you're saying, and it's kind of interesting how that works. I'm guessing listeners are like, what are they talking about? But it's like, It's the exact type of vague that I feel like we're going to address when we actually get into our top 20. But I mean, it is interesting because they're kind of going in opposite directions in some ways and doing really different things. And it's been kind of fascinating to see just how different they feel. I don't want to say anything because I feel like this is going to come up a lot, but it is interesting. And there is a divide there. All right. I have to ask about the X-Men. From the Ashes, there was a relaunch for them this year. This might be a spoiler too, but how are you feeling about that overall? There's a lot to pick from.
You know, overall, I was ready for the Krakoa age to end and just get on to the next thing. And I think this has been pretty good. I've enjoyed books. I don't want to spoil too much, but I've enjoyed books and then others not so much. So it's been an interesting go of it. It's so hard to walk the line on this.
I know. Here's a question I think is kind of interesting because I know one of their goals was to kind of give people a feel of the way that X-Men comics used to be, rather than kind of like Krakoa was a big swing. It went way different in a lot of different ways. Does the From the Ashes stuff feel more like X-Men used to be in your mind?
To some degree, a couple books maybe, but overall they seem like it's almost like the X-Men Babysitters Club. Like they've all picked up young mutants in all these books for the most part, except for like X-Men.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So I don't know if From the Ashes was the best name for it. Like
I don't think X-Men Babysitters Club would have really sold the books in the same way.
I don't know. I'd have bought that shit. You ever read Babysitters Club? High quality work.
I mean, also some of the more popular graphic novels in the actual comic industry these days. I don't know if you know that, but very popular.
I did not know that. That's hilarious.
Yeah. It's actually kind of funny. There's a legacy of amazing cartoonists. Do you know who Raina Telgemeier is by chance?
No.
Raina Telgemeier is one of like probably the two most popular American comic creators of like the past like 15, 20 years. And she started with Babysitter's Club. That was one of her first really big projects, doing that at Scholastic, and then hands off to somebody else and hands off to somebody else. Every time somebody takes that project on, they eventually become a very popular creator. Also because they're really good. But it is just kind of funny. Babysitter's Club, actually not really secretly, but quietly a pretty big powerhouse in the comic industry.
That's crazy.
There you go. But not the X-Men Babysitter's Club, unfortunately.
No.
Where does it rate in your comic-related things power rankings that the writer of Storm, Murwa Ayadeli, said he's working Maggot into the second arc of that series, at least in part because he wants to end up on our year-end lists?
I'd rate that pretty high if Maggot shows up. We're a couple books in and there's no Maggot so far, so...
He said the second arc.
Oh, second arc. Okay.
Yeah, he's coming in the second arc. I think he was planning on showing up on our list next year, so...
Okay. Well, he gets a mention this year because that book is beautiful. And it's written very well. It's an engaging book, and visually it's stunning. So I'll be there for the second arc.
Is that a list spoiler?
I don't know.
When I saw that, I was just like, oh my God, I can't wait to share this with Brandon.
Yeah, I was pretty stoked to see that. That was pretty great.
I love how many creators just, well, first off, we'll like specifically reference Maggot because of you, but also like it's like an identifying characteristic. It's like, oh, it's like, yay, hi. Loves Maggot, and they're like, I know exactly who you're talking about. It's Brandon.
Yeah. I remember going all the way back to like our New York City Comic Con, like when we did the Image
Oh, Party.
party and trying to pitch Kieran Gillen on putting Maggot in there. I was drunk as hell and he was not having it. He's like, give me one good reason. And I was like,
Because I
he's
want
awesome.
you to.
Yeah.
I'm shocked that didn't work. Well, it's working out in the long run. I mean, Russell Dodderman put him in a scene for you. And then on top of that, he's shown up. I mean, not entirely because he's shown up in Storm, but at least in part. Enough to be referenced in an interview. And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Things may be quieting down for the holidays, but not over on Zoop. There's still time to back Megaton Man from Don Simpson and Fantagraphics, The Awakening from Alex Segura, Michael Marizzi, and Dean Kotz, Thunder Guardian from Riley Brown and his son, as well as other live campaigns. More campaigns are coming soon to Zoop from Joe Quesada, Rodney Barnes, Exhibit, and Jonathan Wayshak, and more that are yet to be announced. Zoop would like to thank all the creators who have recently submitted projects and urge all creators to submit your project to Zoop. Click the Submit Your Project link at zoop.gg as they are providing services to even more creators than ever before. And now, back to the show. That's enough of that. We've been dancing around it too much. We just have to get into the top 20. It is time for our countdown of our top 20 comics and graphic novels of the year. Before we get into it, though, I want to establish the ground rules and caveats you need to know. We are going to start with our honorable mentions before we share our 20 favorites, and we'll do so snake draft style, which makes sense for anyone who's ever done a fantasy sports draft and may not make sense for others. So basically what it means is one person will go, then the next person will go twice, the next person will go twice, back and forth until we're done through the entire list. That's how it'll work. As per usual, I always say that these are my favorites of the year, not the best, because I don't feel like I'm qualified to say what the best are. Brandon's are the best, so just keep that in mind. But either way, there'll be 20 of them. Brandon, the big question is, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Host's choice.
I'll go first. Okay, so honorable mentions. I have 5 of them because I like talking about stuff, and also because I have to do a 25 item list for my write-up on Sketch, so I already have the top 25 created. The first honorable mention and the biggest, well, one of the 2 biggest cheats on my list. I have a massive cheat this year, Brandon. It is insane how big it is. One of my cheats is I have a rule that says that basically if it's a single issue series, 3 issues have to be out, or an equivalent amount of pages for 3 issues. That is kind of where my exception comes in. One of my honorable mentions is Aliens vs. Avengers by Jonathan Hickman, Esad Ribic, Yves Svorcina, and Corey Pettit. If that series all came out this year and they were as good as the first 2 issues, the amount I love Aliens and like the way that this story is working, it very well could have been a top 5 book for me. I have absolutely loved that series. It is awesome. I love the fact that it could have been just this cheap tie-in, and yet it's just Hickman and Esad Ribic doing Marvel the end, but aliens are killing them. Aliens from the movie Aliens. It is so awesome. I absolutely love it. Another honorable mention houses The Unholy by Ed Brubaker, Sean Phillips, and Jacob Phillips. It's another great entry by them doing their thing. It's kind of funny. They're almost so good. I feel like they're kind of underrated at this point, but I really love that book. Vera Bushwhack, which is a comic by Sig Burwash, a cartoonist, a graphic novel by Sig Burwash. That comic, when I first read it, I was just like, I don't know if this is going to be anywhere near my list. And then I just kept thinking about it and kept thinking about it and kept thinking about it. And I was like, that's a sign. And so it ends up going to the honorable mentions. It is a wild comic that is very poignant and also insane. And I kind of loved it. The Gulf by Adam D'Souza, which is a coming of age graphic novel about 3 kids going to join a commune right as they graduate from high school and learning a lot on the way. It's also about friendship. It's about all kinds of stuff. It is the best version of that type of story this year. And then lastly, a short comic from Shortbox Comics Fair, Dead Days by Alice Scarpa. That is just a little story about a girl who visits a town in Italy with her family and just her reminiscing in this, as she called it in the back, auto fiction story. It's just an incredibly charming story and it has great art. It is fantastic. What are your honorable mentions?
I don't have as much detail on my honorable mentions, but I'll list some books here that I really enjoyed. The Power Fantasy just barely didn't make my list. I actually really enjoyed Absolute Power, the actual mini series. That almost made my list, but just quite didn't. And then also Duke from the G.I. Joe Energon universe. That book was up there, but just didn't make it. Just a little bit here.
I gotta say, I really like Duke. I thought that was a really good book.
Yeah, it was fun.
It was a really fun action book, and the art was amazing. Like Tom Riley and Jordi Belair were really good on that.
Yeah.
All right, that takes you to number 20. What is your number 20?
Number 20 for me is Green Arrow from DC Comics by Joshua Williamson. And it begins. Will Brandon mispronounce how many names? Sean Isaacsy.
I think it's just Isaacs.
Isaacs.
I could be wrong. Apologies either way.
Yeah, I apologize for all creators tonight. No matter how hard or simple your name is, there's a chance I'm going to butcher it.
That's okay. So Green Arrow.
So Green Arrow. I really enjoyed it. Tied into Absolute Power, which I enjoyed. He played a key part in everything that was going on with Amanda Waller. I've really enjoyed what Joshua Williamson did. He's off the book now, and they've moved on. But during his time, they really incorporated the Arrow family, and I really enjoyed that family element and bringing all those characters back in a rotation that maybe some disappeared after the 52. So yeah, I really enjoyed Green Arrow.
So in Absolute Power, I read the Free Comic Book Day tie-in, and then I also read the Batman issues. So he was like aligned with Amanda Waller?
He was, but he was like, because it's a comic, he was like mind wiped into believing that he was with her, so that way he didn't give up that he wasn't with her or something like that.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, he's always like the rebel, and he's always like the renegade. It was really weird to see. When I saw that, I was just like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. They made it make sense.
Yeah, he was like the ultimate inside man.
Oh, so he was inside man through mind wipe. Basically, they Men in Blacked him, and then he just didn't remember. And they're like, "Yeah, sure, you like this stuff, right? Yeah,
absolutely.
Team up with Failsafe. This is great." I didn't read Absolute Power. I've been meaning to actually read it because, it was Mark Waid and Dan Mora. So I like what they did with a lot of this stuff. I just never went back and read it. I got to get on it. All right, my number 20 is a graphic novel called In Utero by Chris Gooch. It is, I don't even know how to describe it. There's this movie called Colossal that has Anne Hathaway and Jason Sudeikis, and it's basically, this is a weird way to describe it, but I swear there's a point. It's basically a kaiju movie, but it's really, a lot of times kaiju movies are not about just being kaiju and stuff like that, but it was really about like toxic masculinity and basically Jason Sudeikis being the opposite of Ted Lasso in every way, shape, and form, amongst other things. But it was like a really unique take on kaiju stories. I love kaiju stories, but I also love unique takes on it because I've seen like a million kaiju stories. In Utero is definitely that. And it was a really fascinating story. It's about this girl who goes to a holiday camp in this like super ghetto shopping mall and ends up finding out, basically making friends with I feel like this is super spoiler, but making friends with a kaiju, and then like it ultimately resulting in some clashes. I'll say that. But it's like, it's a combination of a kaiju story, but also like a coming of age story where this girl is kind of figuring out her way and then also figuring out her family and all of her relationships and stuff as all this is going along. And it's beautifully drawn. It is such a unique story. I absolutely loved it. It was a really great book. I don't have it because I actually checked it out on Hoopla. Hoopla, low-key MVP of the year. I don't know if you've ever used it, but if you have a library card, you can use Hoopla to just like check out comics like you would in the library. And they have all these graphic novels. They have single issues that hit every week. If you haven't checked out Hoopla, listeners, you definitely should because it totally rules. But In Utero also did, like I said, beautiful art, really impactful story. It's a kaiju story, so I loved it. Big monsters, what's not to like? Just a great comic. Number 19 for me is a long-standing favorite. It's Kaya by Wes Craig, Jason Wordie, and World Design. It's an Image comic series that's about, it's like a Chosen One story that is about a badass girl with a super awesome metal arm and her kind of useless brother who is this aforementioned Chosen One who's magic. And this year it was really continuing their journey to try to get to a specific land so he can learn how to become the appropriate Chosen One. And the big thing that really makes this book sing every single time is Wes Craig's art. If you read the DC All-In special that had like Scott Snyder and Josh Williamson and Daniel Semper, Wes Craig drew half of it. He did the dark side half of it. And that guy just totally rocks. His art is amazing. And Kaya had another great year. I think it's one of those books that gets kind of slept on because it's been going for like 22 issues, which is like an eternity for this this period in time. But it is such a good comic. It was, I think, a top 5 book for me this year, but it's just a big year in comics for me. What is your number 19?
Number 19 for me is Wolverine Deep Cut by Chris Claremont and Edgar Salazar.
Ooh.
Was a big fan of the idea of this, that it basically fills in a gap during the Outback years and involves Wolverine going and like fighting Reaver clones, and then eventually getting to the point where he's fighting them. And yeah, it was awesome. It was everything you'd want from a Claremont book.
So those flashback books are interesting for me. I don't know if you're reading a lot of them, but I just find it really interesting they're doing so many stories like that. Do you generally like those, or did that one just really stand out for you?
It depends, but a Claremont Wolverine and it fits in during the Outback years, like I'm sold. I just, the premise of it alone, I'm in. And the quality was exactly what I hoped it would be. I know there's, some detractors out there who think, a lot of the later Chris Claremont stuff's not so good, but when he goes back and does stuff in the time period that he wrote, I think he fits in there more seamlessly, and it works out really well.
So Claremont still got it for you if he's in the right time and place.
Yeah, if he's in the right time and place, definitely. But I also liked Extreme X-Men, so what the fuck do I know? So...
Oh my God. I've been building my Uncanny X-Men collection, and I thought of you when I was getting issues in the 400s, and I got all of the Draco, and I was just like, Brandon would have thoughts about this.
Oh, terrible.
It's like the one arc that everyone knows the name of, mostly because it's bad.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not great.
That's cool that's one of your books. What is number 18 for you?
Number 18 for me is Uncanny X-Men by Gail Simone and David Marquez. That book, so the cover of the first issue with all of their fists and like Nightcrawler's tail, that was such an awesome cover. And then you put Gail on a book, on an X-Men book, and I'm in. And then the makeup of the team, like you've got Gambit, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Rogue, Jubilee, like it's a murder's row of like characters that I really enjoy from the 90s.
Yeah.
And so you throw them all on a team, and they did pick up some of the Babysitter Club duties, but overall, and it's all set in like Louisiana and the Bayou, and it's just, I think it's been a really good run, and it's been nice that it's been separate from the other X-Men books up until now, where, now all of a sudden it's the battle for Grey Malkin or something like that. But up until that point, I was really enjoying them keeping everything separate for a while and really focusing on the characters that they had.
It is kind of funny. I feel like Gail Simone kind of won like the character draft, if that makes sense. And she got so many amazing characters in there.
Yeah, she did. And I don't know how that works, but yeah, she definitely pulled the list.
David Marquez's art is so good in that book. It's really crazy.
So
that first issue, when they had like the fight with like the dragon thing on top of like the Aztec temple, that was, I mean, it's just so beautiful. I don't know. I want to say that like people kind of forgot how good Marquez is, but I'm really glad to see him on a major book like this and being a big part of like a relaunch.
Yeah, of a big ass book. I mean, it's been a long time since we've had an Uncanny X-Men book. So
yeah,
getting it and being on that relaunch, I think they nailed the team.
Yeah, I think Uncanny X-Men is really solid. It's been interesting to see those different books and like the different tracks that they're kind of going down and like the different paths you can kind of take. A spoiler alert, none of the X-Men books are going to be on my list, but I will say this. I think that there are too many X-Men books right now, but I do appreciate that the 3 main ones do have kind of different feels to them. Uncanny X-Men and Exceptional X-Men and X-Men feel different enough that they make sense as a big 3. And I like that about them.
Yeah, I would agree, except for the Babysitter Club running theme.
Not for the X-Men, though. Not for the X-Men.
Not for X-Men. X-Men, no, they just got Retro Beast.
Jed McKay says, fuck them kids.
Yeah.
That's right. All right. Number 18 for me, I actually have this one in front of me. Helen of Windhorn. It is by Tom King, Bilquis Evely, Mateus Lopez, and Clayton Coles. It is basically a 6-issue miniseries that is about, there's a lot of layers to this one, but ultimately it's about how one of the greatest fantasy authors in the history of books was basing things off of his own family. And it's about his daughter and his father uniting to kind of bring their family back together, but also take you into this world And also it has this additional layer of like these people who engage with the story and how the story goes on past that through generations. And the big note about it is I'm doing my creators of 2024 list. Bilquis Evely was my artist of the year because her work on that is just absolutely astonishing. She did Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, and people love that. This shows that she continues to get better, which is really amazing. And Mateus Lopez's colors on it is so good. But also it's just like, it's a really emotional story and it's a really unique take on the idea of fantasy stories. And I absolutely loved it. I thought that there was a pretty good potential for it to be a really solid comic. It dramatically exceeded my hopes for it, and it's just fantastic. Yeah, I really loved it, and I'm looking forward to people picking it up when it hits trades, because I think it'll be even better in trades. Going back to you, Scott Hazelwood, it's a great book in single issues, but I bet it'll be even better in a satisfying chunk of a trade paperback. My number 17 is my biggest cheat. Brandon, are you ready for this?
Yeah, I'm ready for the cheat.
Number 17 is not a comic. It is the entire Ultimate Universe by Jonathan Hickman, Marco Cato, Dennis Camp, Juan Frigeri, Peach Momoko, Zach Davison, Brian Edward Hill, Stefano Caselli, and a whole lot more. Brandon, I wanted to have all these books on my list, but I didn't want to take the spots, so I cheated. Really big time.
The biggest cheat of all cheats.
Super big cheat. I have 4 comics in one spot. To be honest, the ones that would have most likely to make it would have been Ultimate Spider-Man and Ultimates. But I like Ultimate X-Men a lot because it's insane, and Peach Momoko is insane, and it looks great. I really like that. And people are a little mixed on Ultimate Black Panther. I actually think Ultimate Black Panther is really solid, and Stefano Caselli is a badass, and that book looks great. I think people are kind of sleeping on that one. It's a really solid comic. I kind of consider it's kind of like the Duke of the Ultimate Universe, where it's like people really focus on Transformers, or they focus on G.I. Joe, but they're kind of sleeping on like kind of like the underrated side book. Not to make it the underrated side book, but Ultimate Black Panther is great. Ultimates, though, is probably my favorite. I love everything Dennis Camp and Juan Frigeri are doing on that book. It is kind of like the Ultimates was back then, but for 2024. It feels very much of the moment in a very good way, but it's also just a great action story. And then I love that Jonathan Hickman and Marco Cato are doing this, like, what if Spider-Man was a dad story? And like all this other stuff is going on. It's just, it's Ultimate Spider-Man is probably the most consistently fun and entertaining single issue comic series I'm reading. It feels like putting on a really nice sweater. It's just nice and comfortable, and I like it. But it's also, I know, eventually going to go to some crazy places because they have big plans for this Ultimate Universe. But I was a little mixed going into the Ultimate Universe because I thought Ultimate Invasion was fine, and I thought that the Ultimate Universe one-shot going into it was also fine. Those books, on average, are way more than fine. They're really, really good. And I am just really enthused with Ultimate Universe. And also, I like that Marvel, against all odds, actually survived an entire year of just having 4 comics on the line. Now they have Ultimate Wolverine coming, so they're already moving past that. But lasting a year is like miraculous for Marvel. So good job, Marvel. I didn't believe in you, and I was wrong.
Only one of those books make my list.
Oh, interesting. Well, we'll find out which. What is your number 17, I believe?
Yeah. Number 17 for me is X-Men by Jed McKay and Ryan Stegman. I enjoyed the Alaska centralization, having been from Alaska and living there forever. I love that they're all based up in Alaska. I love that they're not Babysitter Club in it. I love the cast. I'm really interested in getting more on Magneto in the chair. I've been finding out what's going on, why he can't fix himself, and whatever. But again, I enjoy the core unit like I do with Uncanny X-Men. I love that they brought back like the old school Beast, and he's kind of catch up and live underneath the guise of having to deal with what the previous Beast did, who is his not previous, but his future. So
comics.
Yeah, comics. So I really enjoy that. I really hope they attach him to Wonder Man at some point, though.
Yes.
And I've been waiting for that crossover. But overall, I think it's a great book. It's one of the higher ups on my list for the X-Men for this relaunch. But overall, great book.
Did it have you Google whether or not there's a Merle in Alaska?
It 100% did not, because I don't want to know. I don't think it exists, but I don't want to know. I don't want it ruined for me.
I want to tell you, I did Google it though, because there's so many towns that we don't know.
Yeah.
For listeners that don't know, which I imagine is very few of you, I currently live in Alaska. Brandon used to live in Alaska. And if anyone should know whether or not there's a Merle, it would probably be us. And yet neither of us actually knew. We will not reveal whether or not it's an actual thing. I love that they live in a Sentinel factory.
Yes. There's so many creative ideas in that book.
It's really fun. I also really enjoyed the issue where Cyclops like sits in a diner and like talks to I forgot what the organization, like the one or whatever the hell it is. I don't even know what the group is. The government people who are like, oh, you know, you got to start behaving properly. It's like, I'm gonna eat some pancakes.
Yeah.
You put a superhero in a diner, and I'm gonna be all about that issue. I love it.
Nice.
What is your number 16?
Number 16 for me is Spider-Man Reign, number 2 by Care Andrews. I really enjoyed that book. The first book, when it came out, I remember picking it up and it was notorious because it had the Peter Parker peener.
Yeah.
But like, this is a whole nother level of crazy. You're playing with time and space. You've got buffed out Miles Morales. You've got characters like the new Black Cat, who I won't get into the identity on that because that's spoilers. But overall, it was just such a fun book, but it was dark and fucked up. You just see how miserable Peter is and how he gets in this cycle of like almost abusing himself to try to, you know, get Mary Jane back. And it's just, I don't know, it was a really good book. It was a Spider-Man book on the surface, but I think it was a little bit deeper than that as you got into it. And it was a great sequel to the first one.
Is that over?
Yeah, I think it ended this month. I haven't read the last issue yet.
Okay.
Still made my list.
I've not read any of it. It's really weird. I never would have imagined a Spider-Man Reign 2.
No.
But then like the fact that they did one like a decade later or whatever, or like however long it was, 14 years later.
Yeah.
Is really actually the most surprising part about it. I think I liked the first one. I haven't read it in a really long time, but I think it's Kari. I could be wrong.
Okay.
I have no idea. I like, apologies if I mispronounced, but his art is always so interesting. And it's like, I don't know, you know, you're going to get something singular and unique when you read one of his comics. And that certainly seemed to be the case this time.
Yeah. And I'm a big fan of like time and space and dystopian futures and all that shit. This book was just perfect for that.
Do we get a lot of those these days? I feel like they were everywhere in the 90s. Back then it was like Future Imperfect, Age of Apocalypse, all these different like alternate realities where everything is horrible. Maybe they just don't want to do that anymore because they're just like, people don't need that right now.
They're like, reality's horrible. We don't need that.
I guess that is kind of the absolute books once again, but still.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to check that out. Once it's on Marvel Unlimited, I'm going to go check it out. But my next book is a Marvel book that you can check out on Marvel Unlimited right now. It is Fantastic Four by Ryan North, Ivan Fiorelli, Carlos Gomez, Jesus Abartov, Joe Caramagna, and more. It is, you know, spoiler alert for the rest of my list, it's my favorite Marvel book. There's a lot of things I really like about this. I love the fact that every story is 1 issue or 2 issues long, which is actually really satisfying. And also, not only are they 1 issue or 2 issues long, every story feels like very substantive. It's like very meaty when you just read this one story. Like issue number 25, which I don't want to get into spoilers on, involves an alternate version of Earth-ish where something changed. And you kind of feel like you go through everything in that story. And it's crazy. And like there's another issue where it's about Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm working in a grocery store near them and like just trying to be the employee of the month over and over and over. And like, you would think that would be really slight, but it's actually really fun. Ryan North finding all these different ways to tell stories that feel like Fantastic Four stories, but also unlike any other Fantastic Four story you've ever read is really amazing. And the fact that he succeeds every single time. He made a Blood Hunt tie-in that was amazing. I didn't read Blood Hunt at all. When you can nail a tie-in in the midst of your flow without losing anything of your own book, kudos to you. The art is good. It is kind of funny because I've always kind of wondered what this book would be like with somebody who is a bit more on the same wavelength of Ryan North, but like there's superhero artists that fit superhero stories well. Fantastic Four is a ton of fun. It is my favorite Marvel book month in and month out. I never know what I'm going to get, and I really like that about it. So that is my number 16. My number 15 is a book that I mailed to Brandon because I'm an idiot, and I actually ordered 2 copies of it. And I'm very good at life, apparently very good at ordering things multiple times. It's called Dog Days by Kumsuk Gundry Kim. So, Brandon, I'm sure you probably noticed it just based off of Instagram, but after I, adopted a couple cats, I basically have turned into a completely psychopathic animal owner who now values animals to like an outrageous degree. And this entire book is basically about a couple in South Korea adopting their first dog and like figuring out what it is to be a dog owner. But then on top of that, figuring that out when they live in the countryside of South Korea, in a country that has a variable relationship with dogs, to put it in the slightest. And it's told in little vignettes where every story has like a theme and a purpose, and it's helping you understand these people and their animals and the country's relationship with these animals, and also like the animals in their neighborhood and everything like that. And I simultaneously was like amazed by it, but also was like perpetually ready to have my heart broken, because I was like, one of these animals is gonna die, and I'm gonna be really upset at them, and that's gonna happen. I know it's gonna happen. And I just kept reading, and I kept reading, and I kept reading. And I'm not gonna say if that happened, but I will say that I was so emotionally invested in this entire comic. The funny thing is when I got it in the mail, I knew I would like it just based on the cover, because I just think the cover is really beautiful. I sat down, we'd just gotten a new bed frame, and I was like, I'm going to try this. I'm going to lay on this bed, and I'm going to get this, read a little bit of this new comic. And I read like 3 pages. And I'm like, that's enough. I'll just read another page. And I was like, I'll just read another page. I sat and I read the entire thing in one sitting because I was like so absorbed by it. It's a great comic. It is also, I think, an important comic if people would like to understand a country's relationship with animals more. The afterword by the cartoonist is wonderful as well, and it helps you contextualize what the story is and like why it's important for people to know about it. It's such a good book. I loved it. But yeah, that is my number 15. Brandon, what is your 15?
My number 15 is Geiger by Jeff Johns and Gary
Ooh.
Frank. I really enjoyed that book. Like I said, the Ghost Machine stuff really hit with me. And Geiger was one of those books that really hit. Following Tariq Geiger, the glowing man.
The glowing man.
And his two-headed dog.
What is it to it? Barney?
Barney, yep. And Nate the Nuclear Knight. Like, they've just built up such a great little cast on that book. And the art is Gary Frank to his best. It's beautiful stuff. And Jeff Johns laying out great ideas and humorous plots. Like when you've got a guy like the Nuclear Knight who is just out of place with it, Tariq. It's just, I don't know. I've really enjoyed the book. I like, again, the dystopian future vibe, my callback on that one, and just seeing how eventually this connects into everything else with this universe, because it's on the timeline in the back. So it's got to connect somehow. And so I've really enjoyed like trying to get to that and reading the other books to see where they fit in and things of that nature. So really strongly suggest this book.
I read the first limited series right before I talked to Jeff Johns, and I was really impressed. It's just such a entertaining read, and it kind of feels like it's so in the wheelhouse of Jeff Johns and Gary Frank, but also something neither of them have been able to do in a very long time, because like they've been doing superhero stuff. And it's kind of like a superhero book, but it also has like this really personal feel to it, and also like this just broadly entertaining nature to it that, I don't know. Like, I loved in the limited series where they like have these weird casinos with all these people who like are surviving this nuclear wasteland and stuff like that. It's really inventive, and it's a very entertaining comic. I haven't read any of the new stuff, but I was really impressed. It felt like Jeff Johns was reinvigorated in particular, and Gary Frank is just like, he's a metronome. You always know what you're going to get from Gary Frank, and it's going to be great.
Oh yeah, just beautiful stuff.
What is your number 14?
Number 14 for me is Batman Dark Age by Mark Russell and Mike Allred. It's the Superman Space Age team, but doing a Batman book. So I was totally involved in that. I was ready to go as soon as I heard that was announced. and it did not disappoint. I love that they put it in there in like historical context, like they reference Vietnam, and that plays a whole aspect of the book. And so it was kind of cool because that's not always something that gets incorporated into the regular Batman books anymore. They don't draw back on history that far. It ages the characters a little bit to reference Vietnam nowadays, but it worked perfectly in a book like Batman Dark Age, where you're getting the earlier Batman all the way up through, because you start out with him as a kid and kind of being a little prick and then getting all the way up to the point where he's Batman. So fun book.
Would you say that Mike Allred is kind of one of those constants for you where it's just like, if he's drawn a book, you're just going to check it out?
Yeah, 100%. That's a buy for me immediately.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of funny because it's like, I don't think I'd ever asked you what you thought of those books. I haven't read them. Mark Russell's awesome. Mike Allred's awesome. I'm kind of shocked that I haven't read them.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe this is the push I need because I like the fact that DC's been giving, I think that both the books are like 3-issue stories, 3-issue minis.
I think it's 6 issues.
Is it 6? Okay. I like the fact that they're giving them space to just kind of do their thing on different characters and just seeing what they come up with. But yeah, I'll have to check that out because you know it's going to look good at the very least.
Yeah, and they're perfect for trade paperback too.
Yeah. My number 14 is a graphic novel called Lunar New Year Love Story. It's from Jean Luen Yang and Liu Yen Pham. One of the most beautiful books of the year. Liu Yen Pham's been drawing graphic novels and picture books for a long time, and she is absolutely spectacular. This book looks so good. Her inking is incredible. It's a story about a girl who basically has 1 year to find love, or basically she's going to have to give her heart up to, I mean, it's metaphorical, but like she thinks she's literally giving her heart up to this kind of imaginary friend she's had for an entire life that's a representation of a saint. But it is a fantastic look at different cultures. It is a fantastic look at love. And it is also just like incredible character work. You kind of know what you're going to get with Jean Luen Yang because he's good at everything he does. But the thing that really differentiates this book is Liu Yen Pham. I mean, just spectacular cartooning. I thought it was such an immersive read and it just felt so real because of her art. And I just loved it. My next pick is going to begin a trend for this episode, but I guess that's kind of a spoiler for you and for listeners. My next pick is a manga series called Marriage Toxin by Joe Miyake and Mizuki Yoda. And this comic, Brandon, is absolutely insane. It is completely insane. It is about this dude. Actually, it's funny. It actually has a common theme with Lunar New Year Love Story. Basically, like there's this guy named Hikaru Gero who is a poison master. He is part of this long legacy of masters at assassinating people using poison. That's like his whole thing. That's his life. That's his job. He's from like generations of them and he's like the best at it. And he is horrible at people and he's horrible at women in particular. And his sister has a girlfriend, and because they have to keep the family name going, she's being forced to marry someone, but he sacrifices for her. And he's like, I will marry someone before you have to be forced to doing this. And the whole thing is him trying to figure out women so he can marry someone, even though he can't really talk to them. And also being helped by this person who's basically like a swindler of rich people. And it's basically a combination of nonstop insane fights and him trying to get dates and figuring out how to talk to women and like figuring out how to develop commonalities when his entire life is poisoning people for a living. It's like completely psychotic, Brandon, but I love it. It's really fun. It's kind of like a superhero book, but on acid. And if they were trying to date everyone, I don't even know how to describe it. It's great. The guy should objectively be a villain. And yet I cannot help but root for him. And also the fact that like he starts taking jobs that, you know, basically help him from a dating standpoint, makes him less of a villain, more of a hero. So that's good. But yeah, Marriage Toxin. This came out of nowhere for me. And I just absolutely love it. There's 4 volumes in English right now. And I've read all of them and they're all fun as hell and crazy. What is your number 13?
Number 13 for me is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Volume 2 for IDW.
As in like the new one from Jason Aaron and everybody?
Yeah, the current stuff. Rest in peace to the old, in with the new with Jason Aaron. We've had Joel Jones, Raphael Albuquerque, Cliff Chang, and Chris Burnham, I think are the first 4 issues. I've really enjoyed that they haven't tossed out the old continuity. They took some time. They separated the brothers out, They slowly have been bringing them back together. And then they have the side titles, which are dealing with the other stuff like Mutant Town, Fallout, things like that. So I've really enjoyed that they haven't thrown out the baby with the bathwater. But this book in particular has been really fun to see where each turtle is and their hesitancy to get back together and, the build up to why that is. And the art has been an all-star team so far. You cannot go wrong with what we've had so far at all. It's a beautiful book. It's well told. Jason Aaron is on hot fire. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel with them relaunching the IDW stuff, because that was a book that was in my top 5, or top 3, top 1 for years.
You might be the biggest fan of Tom Waltz in the world.
Yes, there's a good chance of that. I love you. But yeah, so I was pleasantly surprised to see that this new era is not, again, a complete restart, but more of a reshuffling of the deck, which is totally fine and understandable because you can't just do the same thing over and over again. You got to push in a new direction. So totally enjoy it.
I was really interested to see how you'd feel about this, just because I knew you liked that previous era so much, and they had made that so big and so specific in its own way that I was curious if you would feel that kind of going back to I don't want to say back to basics, but kind of back to the roots and everything like that would feel like backsliding to you in a negative way. But it seems like you like it.
Yeah, no, I think it's a nice move back to status quo without getting rid of all of the expanded universe that's been developed. And I think that's the tightrope that they walked, that they nailed. Yeah, so I'm impressed.
It helps a lot that they do have amazing artists. I think Derek Robertson's doing number 5, and number 6 is Juan Ferreira. And Juan Ferreira is going to be the artist going forward. So it seems like it's kind of amazing to think that Jason Aaron is writing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
It's wild, but it's so great.
Yeah. I mean, they really made it a priority, and it seems like it's worked. I mean, I think that they were probably afraid of what we were just talking about, where it's like, what will readers think after having like this kind of era for so long? But I mean, it is kind of interesting to think about that in the context of like Transformers, where Transformers had the same thing with IDW for years. They had this whole continuity, fans loved it. And then Daniel Warren Johnson came in, and maybe some readers felt like they were a little uneasy, but it won like 3 Eisner Awards this year and is selling tons of comics. So I think it's working out.
Yeah, I would say so.
What is your number 12?
Number 12 for me is Local Man by Tim Seeley and Tony Fleece. Really enjoy that book. Crossjack sucks, as they say. I really enjoyed it. I loved how they skipped from issue 13 to 25 to end the book. So that way it had like an anniversary celebratory 25th issue, even though it didn't earn it, which seemed very crossjacky.
It's so 90s.
But yeah, it's so 90s. And I don't know. I love this book. It made my list last year as well. I was sad to see it end. I didn't know it was ending until I got to the end of issue 25. And then I was really, really sad.
It does not make my list, but I will say what I meant when I said it's so 90s is like the jump from 13 to 25. What a perfect way to end a series that is like very quintessentially 90s, where it's just like you have to end on like the foil cover 25th issue. The only thing that series was missing was a 0 issue.
Yo, yeah, absolutely. They had the swimsuit issue. So,
the Bad Girls one.
Yeah, the Bad Girls one.
I hope it comes back just so they can get a 0 issue.
Yeah, they really need that.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Then, Cruel Universe hurtled you to the brink of oblivion. And soon, Cruel Kingdom throws wide the gateway to a new age of fatal fantasy. Oni Press is proud to unveil a spellbinding new chapter in the distinguished lineage of EC history with Cruel Kingdom number 1, EC's first ever dark fantasy anthology conjuring tales of magic, myth, and murder from forbidden realms long before our own into comic shops everywhere on January 8th. Behold the bloody and barbarous age of wizards, knights, and dragons as reimagined in the immutable EC manner as enchanting writers Chris Condon, Al Ewing, Greg Pak, and Ben H. Winters couple their forces with Iron Rot artists Charlie Adler, Kano, Leo Max, and Andrea Muti to forge a terrifying new vision of death, life, and adventure once upon a time. Cruel Kingdom number 1 on sale January 8th from Oni Press and EC Comics. And now, back to the show. My number 12 was one of your honorable mentions. It is Power Fantasy by Kieran Gillen, Casper Vanguard, and Clayton Coles, and Ryan Hughes, designer Ryan Hughes. I love what they've done in telling, basically this was Kieran Gillen's like response to doing all of his Marvel stuff, where he did Eternals and he did Immortal X-Men. He's like, how can I like push this further? How can I or like feed this back into my creator own stuff? And like doing a story where the people who have superpowers are basically ticking time bombs, taking nuclear bombs that could destroy society, or spoilers for the first issue, kill most of the US government because they're trying to solve problems that are larger than just the US government. The interesting thing is it's like got a very personal feeling to it, but also has this massive scale. Like the fourth issue has this artist who is one of the people who has like the superpowers. And basically like when her mood changes, she turns into the darkest kaiju that the world has ever seen, or like it's alluded that that is what it is. Even in just 4 issues, I am really amazed by how much they've built this story up and this world up. You can really see that they've done a lot already, but there's so much more to come. I think that this book is, I mean, it's number 12 right now. If you told me it was going to be one of my top 5 comics next year, I would 100% believe you. It is just, it's fantastic. And I also love the fact that it's got the data pages, but it uses it in a really smart way. And Ryan Hughes' design is fantastic. And I also love the fact that it is the first comic, I believe, in comic book history where the entire back page is literally just indicia, just a shitload of indicia. And it also has secret messages in it, which is really fantastic. It's a fun book. It's a smart book. It is a great superhero comic without explicitly being a superhero comic. It's like a superpowers book. But yeah, power fantasy, totally rules. Number 11 for me is a IDW book. It is Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees by Patrick Horvath and Hassan Otsman El Howe. It's about a super cuddly bear person who lives in a society or in a small town that has other cuddly animal people, except for she's a serial killer. She basically gets into a situation where she goes head to head against another serial killer that's trying to harsh her buzz in her nice small town, where she just gets to live her life and run her hardware store and kill people in the city every once in a while and just have a nice life. As nice a life as a serial killer can have. But this comic is, I think it's like basically like Richard Scarry meets Dexter is like the easiest comp. It's really awesome. The best part about it, though, is Patrick Horvath's art. The watercolors are amazing. I absolutely love it. It's so beautiful. I love the fact that this guy who is capable of delivering some of the most cuddly and charming art you can possibly see can also vivisect a duck person, and it looks incredible. The guy is capable of everything. But this book is like, it's horrific, but it's also fun, and it's just super engaging, and it's fascinating to see. This isn't the very first comic Patrick Horvath has done, but it's his really first big story. And it deservedly was nominated for Eisner Awards. It deservedly got a lot of praise. I love it. It's just astounding. And there's more coming. And I can't wait to see what they cook up there, because it's a great comic. What is your number 11?
Number 11 for me is a book you've touched on already, Ultimate Spider-Man.
Ooh.
That is the only Ultimate book to make my list, but I really enjoyed this book. One of my low-key favorite aspects of the book is Jonah and Ben.
Oh, yeah.
And that whole dynamic is fantastic. I love that it's Spider-Man as a dad. As a dad, I can connect with that, minus the whole superhero Spider-Man aspect. But
that we know of.
Yes, that you know of. I'd be a villain. Who are we kidding? But yeah, so I really enjoy it. I like the overall Ultimate Universe they've created, but I like this section of it the most. I love the art on Ultimate X-Men. That just is a complete side. Pete Momoko's art is just so fucking good. But that's a complete aside. It has nothing to do with this book. So Ultimate Spider-Man, Marco Cato. We got it. His art is equally as beautiful, though. I love the fight scenes, and like the way he draws like a beat up Spider-Man is just fantastic. Just automatically, I think he's becoming one of those artists for me where I would pick it up if he was on it. And honestly, Jonathan Hickman's already that guy. So great book.
You really liked Kato on Daredevil too, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
He's building a history with me. He
really loves Spider-Man, and you can tell that. Not that it requires you to be a fan to be able to draw Spider-Man well or something like that, but he draws such a good Spider-Man. I especially like when he draws him where he like is not doing great as Spider-Man. You just kind of get this, I don't know, it just feels so right. And there's
Yep.
something about that book that just kind of feels right. And I'm with you though. Jonah and Ben, I love the issue. I don't remember which issue it was, but like they go to like this deli type, or not even like a deli, it's like a bakery. And like Jonah's like, give me a sandwich. And they're like, we don't make sandwiches. He's like, just put something in between two pieces of bread and give it to me. I'm just like, Hickman writes curmudgeons so well. Maybe because he's a curmudgeon himself. Possibly true. I don't know. But anyways, it's Ultimate Spider-Man's a ton of fun. I really like it. What is your number 10?
Number 10 is Cobra Commander by
Ooh.
Joshua Williamson and Andrea Milana.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna go with it. Yeah, so I love seeing the rise of Cobra Commander in the Energon universe and kind of the buildup of his army and how we get to Cobra being an overall threat to G.I. Joe. I loved how it fit with everything else, like Duke and the building blocks for this Energon G.I. Joe universe. I like how all the stories in, like Destro, they all built off each other, Scarlet, and so I love the development of everything we were getting on the Cobra side in this book. And I cannot wait. I haven't read the first G.I. Joe issue yet, but I cannot wait to get into that. And a large portion of that is because of this Cobra Commander book.
That is a really solid book. It is interesting. I don't have like enough of a G.I. Joe background to be able to be like really conversant on like the history stuff. Like the first issue was a lot about, God, I don't even remember what the name of it is, like that secret society of like snake people or whatever the heck it was called. Do you have a G.I. Joe background?
So I do, but I don't with the comics really. Like I was big on the cartoons as a kid. Before there was Ninja Turtles and X-Men, there was G.I. Joe for me. Like I was all about it. I had all the little action figures you could twist around and snap in half with little rubber bands in the middle.
There was enough there for you to like see something like this stuff from the first issue and be like, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, you see vehicles that were toys and stuff like that. Like, yeah. So there was definitely enough in there that I was like, all right, this is fucking awesome.
Yeah, I like that comic a lot. It was interesting to see how they handled the G.I. Joe stuff, where instead of just going straight to G.I. Joe, they did Cobra Commander and Scarlet and Duke and Destro, and just seeing the kind of different flavors of those books. They did a lot of different things, and I think that's a lot of fun. It's good stuff. Josh has done a really good job with the Intertron stuff. I have read the first issue of G.I. Joe. It's really solid.
Okay, I can't wait.
My number 10 is a graphic novel called The Jellyfish by Boom from Pow Pow. And it's kind of a funny thing to say as like a positive, but this is like one of the most stressful comics I can ever remember reading. It's like the way it's handled is just so smart. Basically, there's this person whose vision is basically a jellyfish shows up in their vision, and it's about them trying to navigate their life as that jellyfish turns into two jellyfishes. I guess it's jellyfishes. That two jellyfish turns into three, and so on and so forth, and like trying to figure out what that means and how they're navigating their life. And so it's about a young person trying to find their place in the world, but also trying to navigate something that turns out to be pretty significant health problem. And the way that it's handled in the comic by Boom is you can actually see the jellyfishes, the jellyfishes on the page. Like you'll see like one show up here, like when there's just like one on the page, and then it slowly but surely as it progresses, you can see like ones show up here, one show up here. It starts showing up in their vision, and you're just like, why is this happening? And then it starts multiplying and multiplying. And as the jellyfish multiply, and it starts like actually affecting the read. It's such a incredible way to convey what is happening in the story within the form of comics that it's just, I don't know, it's so smart, but it's also like just a very emotional read. And it kind of puts you in the place of a person who's experiencing what the book's lead is experiencing in Odette. And it's just, I don't know. I didn't really know what to expect from the cover. I kind of expected it to be a horror story. It wasn't a horror story, but it also wasn't not a horror story because it's really stressful. I think if I describe it as really stressful, I think there's like horror-ish elements to it.
Yeah, suspense thriller.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a one-person suspense thriller about them negotiating a new part of their life, but it's some of the most amazing cartooning I've read this entire year. I just absolutely loved it. My number 10, I mean, honestly, like my top 10, fantastic. It's really hard to differentiate amongst, there's like a tier system in there. And I think this was firmly in like the third one, but it easily could have been the second. Next one is The Strange Tales of Oscar Zahn by Tree Wong. I really love their art. They did this graphic novel called Everyday Robot Hero Boy, I think it was, for Skybound Comet that was just so well drawn. But this comic is like Tree doing their thing completely. And it's kind of like I mean, an oversimplification is it's their version of Hellboy, but that's really not what it is. It is about a paranormal investigator, but it's also about a much different type of person and trying to negotiate this world. And it's them like chasing ghosts and trying to solve problems and doing all this stuff. And it's such an immersive read. It's so fun. All the little stories are just so great. Originally, it was a webtoon story, but it's been turned into a graphic novel by 10 Speed Graphic. But the biggest thing on it is the art. The art is amazing. It's just such an absolutely astonishing artist. I love this book. It is something that it kind of, I guess, like comping it to Hellboy again. It's like the type of story that I could just read adventures of Oscar Zahn into infinity because I just love it so much. Like you can just put this character in any place and I just love it. And this first volume, it's volume 1. I hope there's plenty more volumes to come, is fantastic. It's also the type of thing that I think can pretty much work for readers of most ages. It would probably work for like, teens and stuff like that and like 12-year-olds and yada, yada, yada. It's just a fun book. It's very beautiful. Great stuff. What is your number 9?
Number 9 for me is Chip Zdarsky and Daniel Acuna's Avengers Twilight. That was a beautiful fucking book. Anytime Daniel Acuna's on a book, I'm there. Like his art is just so epic. And then Zdarsky was okay. No, I'm just kidding. Zdarsky was dope. The whole story, with a world that doesn't necessarily need the Avengers, but does need the Avengers, and Captain America stepping up, or Steve Rogers stepping up. It was just a cool book. Another, future time and space type story without the time travel in space. But honestly, the key thing for me that I need you to take away from this is that art was fucking beautiful.
Yeah.
I don't know if you checked the book out or not, but
I read it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the thing there's two things that are great about the art. One is that, Daniel Acuna is incredible. Also he'd been working on it for a long time. Chip wrote this before the pandemic, which is really amazing.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And which makes it even more amazing that it is as timely feeling as it is, because it feels very much of this moment. But on top of that, Chip set Daniel Acuna up so well for some really great beats. Like when Thor shows up and you're just like, yeah, woo! There's all these just incredible mic drop moments. And I think that that's one of the things there's a lot of things that are really good about Avengers Twilight, but I think one of the things that really rocks about it is the fact that it has those giant moments that make you love superhero comics, and Acuna kills it on every single one of them.
Yeah, it's like a nice event comic that you don't have to buy tie-ins to. It was perfect.
Yeah, it is. It's like a giant story that just exists to tell that story. Kind of the type of thing I'd like to read more of.
Yeah, we don't get enough of that, I don't think. So
we don't get enough of that. What is your number 8?
Number 8 for me is Radiant Black by Kyle Higgins. And then we had Joe Clark, Eduardo Ferragato, Marcelo Costa. I really love that we were getting the book and then 0.5. And so you'd get the story of Marshall and Nathan.
Those are the 2 Radiant Blacks, right?
Yep. And so you're going back and forth and kind of seeing which one's going to be Radiant Black in the end. And so we finally got an answer on that to end this volume of the book, basically. And so now moving forward into the new year, they'll have one of those 2 guys who want it. I don't want to spoil anything.
I appreciate it. I need to read it still. I have the first 2 volumes and I have not read it. Please don't throw me in comic jail, Kyle Higgins.
Yeah, it's so good. But I'm really excited for whatever comes next, now that we know who's going to be Radiant Black and how that impacts everything, because they were 2 completely different types of characters. So just overall great storytelling. I love the concept again of using the 0.5 in a way that made sense, as opposed to the way Marvel was doing it for a long time there as a cash grab. So big credit there, because I usually the 0.5 thing is not something that works for me based on experience, but it worked totally here.
I love that we're either low key or high key roasting Marvel just regularly here.
Yeah.
I think we might be answering that question I had earlier about Big 2 just implicitly through our actions.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting how we've had a number of books on our list so far that are not Marvel or DC, but are superhero books that work really well. Like Local Man, Radiant Black, Power Fantasy, even. Power Fantasy is not really superhero, but it's like superhero adjacent. And they're like people finding what their vision of that idea is and how you can marry it with other things to give it a slightly different flavor. And I think that Kyle Higgins and the rest of the team of Radiant Black, I think that they were a big part of kind of setting off that trend to some degree. And it's been really cool to see what they've built, even though I'm a monster and still have not read it. I do have a Radiant Black light that Kyle gave me, because apparently on one of the issues you can use a black light on it. So someday I'll use that. I think it's actually lost battery, but I have my own black light. So one day. All right. That was your 8, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. My number 8 is another manga book and a manga series. It's Tokyo These Days by Taiyo Matsumoto. It is a book. This is where we go back to my 20% sad. This one might be more than 20% sad. It's about this guy who is an editor at a manga publisher who just one day quits. The first chapter is called Chapter 1, Today I'm Retiring for Personal Reasons. And it's about him basically striking out on his own and finding out who he is when he's outside of his job. And who he is when he's outside of his job is somebody who wants to do his job, but in a way that actually reflects who he is as a person. And that shit is relatable, Brandon. It's like, wanting to find who you are in your own life is like such a relatable thing. And the entire thing is about this manga editor putting together what his dream book would be. And you meet all the different people who make the comics and you learn their stories and you go through their journey with them. And like, he's trying to like basically rekindle the flames inside of these people after having to kind of pummel themselves to try to make comics and make comics and make comics. And it's really a reflection of Taiyo Matsumoto's kind of, I believe, I mean, I don't know this for sure, but it feels like his views on how manga works and how it's so punishing and how like the need to produce can not lead to the best work. And it's just a really beautiful story. It's also a very sad story, but it's a beautiful story that really, it's only 3 volumes. And by the end of it, it ties it all together in a way that really hits hard. It's just a wonderful comic and it's generated a lot of acclaim. Deservedly so. It's a fantastic book. And I love the fact that it's 3 volumes and done. Sometimes manga stories can be a little bit hard for me to jump into because I'm like, do I really want to read like 100 plus volumes of One Piece? No, I don't. But 3 volumes and with beautiful hardcovers with amazing art. Yeah, I'm all about that. So Tokyo These Days, highly recommended. Number 7 is a massive misdirection. You remember when I said Local Man didn't make my list? I lied. Local Man is number 7 for me.
Nice.
Local Man is by Tony Fleece, Tim Seeley, Felipe Sobrero, and Brad Simpson. I should have picked this up when you had it on your list last year. I didn't because I'm an idiot who doesn't listen to Brandon, and I should be listening to Brandon. I do listen to you, just apparently not about Local Man. Anyways, I picked it up because I listened to a podcast where Tony and Tim talked about the book with Matthew Rosenberg, who hosts the podcast. And they talked about the book and I was just like, this sounds really good. Why haven't I read this? Like, this is really interesting. And then they're like, oh, also it's over. I'm like, shit. I'm like, well, I guess I'll read it now. And then I got all 3 volumes and like, I couldn't get enough. I was just so hooked on it. Like originally when I did my first list, I was like, this is like 14. And then I was like, it's more like 11. And I was like, it's 7. It's 7. 7's right. But that book is so fun and it has so much personality and the art in it is so good. And I love all the nods to 90s comics, whether it's the backups that Tim Seeley does or like that draws, or it's like the, just like Shadowhawk shows up or Boof shows up or like Stryker from Cyberforce shows up, all these random characters. And it's such a good book, but it's like, I don't know. It kind of ties into what I was talking about with Tokyo These Days, where it's just like, what if your life isn't what you want it to be for one reason or another? Or what if you regret the person you used to be? What if Crossjack does suck? Do you have to keep sucking? That's a good question. It's a really great book. Although I have to say the main character's name, Jack Xavier, when I first started reading it, I was just like, why are they misspelling Xavier? I kept thinking that as I was reading it. And I was just like, why are they misspelling it? I was like, oh, wait, his name's actually Xavier. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. My brain was broken by the name.
Yeah.
But Local Man, honestly, is like, I don't know. I'll spoilers for my own list. In a lot of ways, it is the top superhero book on my list, and it's kind of what I want superhero books to be. Like if it's like a superhero comic that feels like it has all of the weight in a lot of ways, it's probably its closest comp in actual superhero comics is Ultimate Spider-Man, where it's a comic that feels like it's about more than just being a superhero comic, and I really like that about it. Local Man, awesome book, highly recommended. What is your number 7?
Number 7 for me is Red Coat by Jeff Johns and Brian Hitch, another Ghost Machine book starring Simon Pure, who is a complete and pure sleazebag, but is also such an enjoyable and lovable character, despite being such a scumbag. I love how they've tied it in history with Benedict Arnold and George Washington, and they've added a whole mythical layer to that. It's a genius book. It's just a lot of fun. It feels a lot like an Indiana Jones book almost, but not at all. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
I haven't read that one, but when I was researching for the interview with Jeff, I saw the premise was basically like, what if the wrong person got immortality? And like, I really like that idea. It's such a good idea.
Yeah, and there's a whole like secret society of people like this, and like George Washington and historical figures that it just makes it ridiculous, but makes it so much awesomer than it needs to be.
And Brian Hitch art.
God, it's so beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, it is kind of funny. Like for a certain type of superhero fan, Ghost Machine really has the market cornered for their art.
They really do. Well, I would argue the writers too are top notch.
That's true. I mean, you got Tomasi, you got Jeff Johns, you got who else? Brad Meltzer, a bunch of different people who are doing really cool stuff. I've only checked out Geiger and Hyde Street. I need to check out more of them.
Hyde Street's good too.
What is your number 6?
Number 6 for me is NYX by Jackson Lansing and Colin Kelly, Francisco Martino, and others. There's been a few artists on this book already. I love this book because it's basically a new X-Men book. If you look at the cast, it's basically all new X-Men characters from that era, and I love seeing them brought back together and used, because that's, instead of, bringing in the Babysitters Club of New Mutants, you've got these established mutants that you could use, like the new X-Men, who are way underused in my opinion. So I like seeing them used and put in situations like where Sophie and the Cuckoos, or how do you say that? Cuckoos. Yeah. They like seeing how they always work together and then having one step outside of the pack and seeing how that reflects upon them. And then, you've got Laura Kinney going out there and doing the Laura Kinney Wolverine stuff. You've got a Knoll with his giant arm. It's just, it's got everything I want from an X-Men book right now.
How's the Ms. Marvel in it?
Ms. Marvel's great. She fits in perfectly. She's not a new X-Men character, but she is a new X-Men character.
Oh, I see what you did there.
So it works out.
Yeah. I've heard from a couple people that that's the best X-Men book going right now.
It's fun, man.
I have not read it. It's one of the ones that I didn't actually end up checking out, but it is funny. The new X-Men, there's nothing wrong with this, because like fundamentally superhero comics are always about creating new characters. But I feel like of all of well, that's not true. There's a lot of forgotten X-Men characters, like the next generation is coming, the lights, this, that. Yeah. But I do kind of feel like those new X-Men have been kind of forgotten to some degree. They got a lot of play in Krakoa, but it kind of seemed like they were skipped a generation to some degree.
Yeah, it's nice to see them brought back.
Yeah, that's awesome. Also, I know that you rep really hard for them, so I figured that if they were going to, if there's any book that you're going to be like, maybe, I don't want to say biased, but you were going to be particularly interested in, ones that have new X-Men characters would probably be one of them.
Yeah, and a book that's bringing in mojo, so
it's got it all. It's
fitting it all. We just need Maggot, and it'll just check.
Sorry, Storm, you don't get Maggot anymore. He's going to NYX. He'd fit in great. He'd fit in great.
He would.
That was your number 6?
That's my number 6.
Okay, number 6 for me is something that fits a trend that I had a couple years ago, which is autobio comics. But this is not purely autobio because it's insane. It's Luke Healy's Self-Esteem and the End of the World. It starts off, I think, autobio, but then it's like just keeps going until it's the end of the world-ish. it's like it starts in the present and then it goes into the future, but it's still like the cartoonist exploring who he is and how he fits in his own life and everything like that. And it is so funny and it is so ridiculous and it is so just, I don't know. I love the art in it and I love the structure. It's always basically always like a 6-panel grid. But there are exceptions to that, but for the most part, it's a 6-panel grid. And it's just like an amazing look at a cartoonist exploring who he is and who the world is and how he fits in there and all these different things. But it's just like, I don't know. It's the type of story where it's almost better to not know what's going on and just go in there and just like watch how far he takes you. It says a lot about humanity and it says a lot about Luke Healy's view of the world and it says a lot about his views of himself. And it's just completely ridiculous, but I absolutely loved it. I got it mostly because I thought the cover looked amazing and I thought it was such a well-designed cover and I just could not have enjoyed it more. It was such a fantastic book and the colors are great. And I don't know. It's actually one of, I think, 2 different comics that I read this year where it's basically about a person who's writing about themselves or telling a story about themselves. But then they were just like, what if I just kept going and just made stuff up about my life well into the future? And this is that. It's just the best possible version of that. I love this book. It's amazing. Number 5 is another Hoopla read. It's one I do not have in front of me, but I will be getting because I absolutely loved it. It's called The Library Mule of Cordoba. It's by Wilfred Lupano and Leonard Cheminot. And it is a French graphic novel that came out a few years ago that was now released in English. And it is a story about a librarian and his assistant who are trying to save an actual society's collection, a massive collection of books from being burned because a new person has taken over and he wants people to not have access to knowledge. Them trying to escape with a ton of books with basically a former intern / thief and the world's worst mule as their only teammates in the exercise of bringing those books out. And it is very funny. It is completely absurd, but it's also very poignant. And by the end, it like perfectly ties into how certain generations throughout society and certain people throughout time don't really want people to have knowledge and how it's about how important it is to preserve knowledge and how important it is to fight for what's important in the world. And you're just like so entertained throughout it. And then it punches you in the gut at the end and how it connects to modern times. And then you think about where we're at and you're just like, this book about a really bad mule carrying a bunch of books through desert is actually one of the most timely books of the entire year. It's so well done. But I do want to give a really big shout out to Leonard Cheminot, whose art on it is just staggeringly good. Like one of my favorite artists of the year. Such a good book. I highly recommend it to anybody, but it's just so impressive. That was my number 5. What is your number 5, Brandon?
Number 5 for me is Wolverine, not the current launch, but the Benjamin Percy Wolverine.
Oh, okay.
I really enjoyed that. It's, specifically the Sabretooth War portion, where it was Benjamin Percy and Victor LaBelle. And then you had Jeff Shaw and Corey Smith on art. So I think that was issues like 41 through 50 with Leinil Yu covers on top of it.
That's a Brandon special.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And then in the final issue of that, Larry Hama was involved. So, it was très magnifique. I haven't really loved the new Wolverine stuff with the Wendigo and all that, but this this with Wolverine battling Sabretooth and going through, and then Ford builds him a sweet armor in the end. Like, it is just so ridiculous and over the top and violent that it just, I couldn't get enough of it.
It's kind of amazing how much Wolverine stuff Benjamin Percy has done.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to compare him to like Larry Hama, but I mean, he is like the most Wolverine of anybody in probably the last 15 years, 20 years maybe.
Yeah, and I've enjoyed a good majority of it.
What did they bring in Larry Hama for?
He did like a backup story or a portion of a story in like the 50th issue, I think.
That's pretty cool that they brought him in, though.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I dropped off that book long before, but I was curious about how you'd feel about the Sabretooth War stuff, because it seemed like a really big arc and it seemed like it was paying off a lot of things and like all the Sabretooth stuff that was going on too. And
Hmm.
I wasn't really sure. I never really got a feel for how people responded to it because it was kind of going on as like the end of Krakoa was going on. And I feel like more people focused on that than like all the stuff with Wolverine and Sabretooth.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure of it.
But apparently you liked it.
I loved it.
What is your number 4?
Number 4 for me is Batman,
Ooh.
another Chip Zdarsky special, and Jorge Jimenez and a variety of other artists. But I really enjoyed that book. Even it was one of those books where it tied into Absolute Power, and I felt like it benefited from it to a degree, like Absolute Power did, not the individual issue, but it built onto that, kind of like Green Arrow did, where it played an integral part of the story, so you felt like it was worth what you were getting. But outside of that, I just have really loved what Chip has done on the book, going back to even last year. I think his time is coming up on the book, isn't it? Because they're doing Hush 2 or something like that after this.
Yeah. I think 157 is his last issue.
Oh, that's disappointing. I've really enjoyed it. I already lost him on Daredevil, so it's disappointing to lose him on this too.
I kind of feel like it's an underrated book. I know that there's some people who are kind of down on it. I think there's been a lot of really interesting stuff in it. I liked all the failsafe stuff. I thought the failsafe stuff was really cool. I didn't love the Joker year 1 stuff or whatever it was called. That stuff was that just kind of felt like, I don't know. I didn't love it. But the Absolute Power stuff, the tie-in, even though I didn't read the Absolute Power series, actually worked for me. And like the current story is really, really good. And also, it's Jorge Jimenez. I mean, like Jorge Jimenez is like one of the best superhero artists you can possibly find today. The guy is just absolutely incredible.
Yeah, gorgeous work.
I'm going to be sad to see him go. I've really enjoyed Chip's entire run. I've enjoyed Jorge's work on it. I know people are really excited I think people are really excited for Hush 2. Brandon, I think you know this. I'm going to tell you anyways. I didn't really like Hush. I'm sorry. I'm saying it. That's my truth.
I loved Hush.
A lot of people do. Maybe it's because I didn't read it when it was in single issues. Somebody told me that like you have to kind of give into the moment of single issues. I'm like, I wasn't reading comics then. I was out, and then I read it in trade paperback, and I'm just like, what is this? What is this?
That was about the time I was getting back in, so it's got a special place for me.
Yeah, I totally get that. It's kind of, I mean, it's different, but it's like I got in. I remember the first comic that got me back into reading single issues was Infinite Crisis, and so I just have forever love for Infinite Crisis because of that. Also because Infinite Crisis was awesome, but still.
Yeah.
My number 4 connects to yours in a way because it's Public Domain by Chip Zdarsky. Public Domain by Chip Zdarsky, written by Chip Zdarsky, drawn by Chip Zdarsky, lettered by Chip Zdarsky, presumably, and edited by Alison O'Toole because Chip can't edit himself. Anyways, it is a comic. It was on my list in 2022. It didn't have any issues in 2023. It came back in 2024. And it's a comic about the people who basically this guy is the actual owner of the most famous superhero in the entire world, the Domain. And when he realizes that instead of like getting all the rights and having this big lawsuit, he's just like, I just want to make my own Domain comics. And it's about him and his family and a couple other people trying to navigate making comics together and what it means and how all that happens, but also all the history and heartbreak that comes with it. This is definitely one of those 20% sad books. While it is very funny and it's really smart and it's just impossible not to just get it completely attached to the story, it also has got a lot of sadness, especially in the most recent issue. But Public Domain is such a smart book and it's so cool. And the fact that this is not one of my picks, but they're making their own Domain comic. And this year, Chip Zdarsky and Rachel Stott and a number of others actually made the comic within the comic and released it. They call it's The Domain, and they released a 5-issue miniseries that honestly, this is going to sound like a burn on Marvel again. I don't mean it to. Was one of the best Marvel comics I read of the year. It felt like a Marvel comic in all the best ways. It was not a Marvel comic. It was an Image release from them. But the fact that this comic is like so well made and so smart that you can actually conceivably release a comic from within the comic and it actually makes sense and makes you want to read it really speaks to how good Public Domain is. I don't think there's enough people that could possibly read it. If everyone could read that was reading Batman, I would be happy, but then I would still want more people to read it because everyone that likes comics should be reading Public Domain. It's so good. Yeah, Public Domain.
I'm going to have to check it out.
I told somebody recently, they emailed me about it and I was just like, I feel like I need to chill out about talking about public domain because I talk about it too much. And I'm like, I don't want to just be like that guy who's just in the middle of a conversation, like, have you read public domain? It's just, nobody wants to be that guy. Actually, I think Chip would want me to be that guy because then I can help him sell more books. But
Absolutely.
my number 3 is another Image comic series. It is called Knights. It's by Wyatt Kennedy, Luigi Formisano, Francesco Segala, Gloria Martinelli, and Maria Letizia Mirabella. And Brandon, if there's one comic that I think you would love from my list that you're not currently reading, it would be this one. It is, let me see if I can just read the back of it because I want you to know. Well, that's not the right thing. Okay, here's what the introduction to the first issue says. It's just establishing the world. Florida is owned by Spain. America consists of 31 states. Vampires, ghosts, and other supernatural creatures are common and benign. The internet is infantile and irrelevant. That establishes what the world is. It takes place in 2003, and it's just basically about 4 friends, one of whom is a vampire, one of whom is a ghost, the other 2 who have other things going on, but I don't want to get into that, living together in Florida in God, I'm forgetting the name of the place that they live. But anyways, in Florida, Santa Pedro, I think it is. They're living in this town and just basically navigating life, man, just living life. And it's about all like the ridiculous tomfoolery they get into. It's about the pains of being a young person who has a lot of change and a lot of life going on. It's about big monster stuff. Luigi Formisano is my single biggest find of the year. And by find, I mean, he already existed, but it's like, I'd never seen his art before. He is like, if you told me in 5 years, he is going to be the biggest artist in comics, I would not be surprised. That guy is so damn good. It is out of control. Francesco Segala's colors, first time I'd experienced Francesco Segala's colors, so good. This book is an absolute blast, but it's also just like, I just love living in the world. I feel so immersed in it. And it is loaded with a bunch of people who make comics their own way and do it in magnificent fashion. Knights is just a tremendous comic, and I highly recommend it. What is your number 3?
Number 3 for me is a book that I kind of spoiled earlier with David, Falling in Love on the Path to Hell.
I want to point out, spoiled because he showed me the fact that he had sent a letter in and it was published with, was it, did Jerry Duggan say hell yes or fuck yes in response?
Fuck yeah, I think he said, yeah.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, it was just what you'd expect from me. It was just a lot of fuck yeah, this book is fucking awesome. But I love this book. This fits into what I was talking about earlier, where I'm able to access different genres that I maybe wouldn't have hit before. So like a love story at its core, at least, is something that I was not expecting to find and enjoy this much. I love that there's like the Lost Island type feel to it, where they're off on this island and it's like, what the fuck is going on? I love the relationship between the 2 main characters and the way that slowly developed, and the way he has his sketch pad with all his nudie drawings of her. It's such a great book, and it's not something that I would have, if you'd have told me I was going to be reading a love story between a cowboy and a samurai next year, I would have said, no, I'm probably not. But I totally am, and I'm loving it. It's one of my top 3 books for a reason. My top 3 this year is so good to me that it was hard. It was hard. It was really difficult, but it went back and forth between 2 and 3. But in the end, I had to go with my number 2.
I like that we're in a place where, I don't know, you get books that you just can't expect loving. And like, first off, why would you expect to even read a comic about a cowboy and a samurai? It's like, where does that come from? It comes from Jerry Duggan's brain, and that's the reason why it exists. And I think that's the cool thing about comics is like my number 3 was a book about an alternate version of Florida where a vampire hangs out with a ghost and a teenager and a monster kid. And they're both completely reasonable things for stories to be about, but also we never would have expected them because they have to come from somebody being creative and being original and being interesting. And I think that's great. I love that is one of your top 3. I will say my top 2, they're like the ones that have a big gap. My top 2 are massive for me this year. But what is your number 2?
Number 2 for me is Grommets.
Oh,
by Rick Remender, Brian Posehn,
Posehn,
and Brett Parson. absolutely love that book. A bunch of delinquent skater kids getting into trouble. The last couple issues with the big fight was incredible. I haven't felt that, like, my stomach was twisting when those kids were getting beat up in the way that it did when Glenn got his head bashed in Walking Dead. Like, I've just come to be so attached to these characters, and to see that happen was so awful, and I was so glad they got out of their spoilers. But that's such a great book. Art is phenomenal. It's got such a good feel of what it was like to be a teenager. You know, I wasn't a teenager in the 80s, but it's got that feel. You know, sometimes you read a book about teenagers and the way that the teenagers are written is kind of really cringy and off. And this is spot on and perfect. It's got that vibe and that kinship that you feel with your friends when you're around that age, where you don't have a great family life in the case of some of these guys, and you get that family that they're building and just delinquency.
I have not read that, but there was something about it where I was like, I hope Brandon reads this because it feels, there's just something about it that feels like it vibes with you. I didn't know why. I was like, this just feels like Brandon.
Yeah, it's a book that I feel like was definitely catered to me in some way.
That is awesome. I'm glad you checked it out. I will have to check it out. I heard Brett Parsons' art in it is fantastic. So
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I'll need to catch up on it. I would listen to a podcast recently. It was the Oblivion Bar podcast, and they did a fantasy draft of comic creators, and one of them drafted Brett Parson of all the creators. And I remember thinking at first, I was just like, that's an interesting pick. But at the same time, it's like, he seems like the type of artist where if it hits you right, it hits you hard.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know, I'll have to check out Grommets. My number 2 is, Brandon, I was very close to the biggest cheat in the history of this list. I almost made it a tie for first because I'm a coward and a terrible person. I didn't, though. I made it number 2. My number 2 is another book that is an adaptation of a French graphic novel turned into English. It's called Frontier. It's by Guillaume Singelin, and it is just one of the coolest science fiction stories I have read in forever. I think you would absolutely love it. It is basically, I mean, it's another one of those books that feels very much of the moment, because while it's about a mercenary and it's about a scientist and it's about like a grunt that is only known living in space, trying to navigate a crazy time for humanity. Oh, and a monkey. I forgot the monkey. The monkey is very important. It's also about just like how corporations use people and the environment and all these different things about how we just kind of are wasteful and destructive for the purpose of making money above all, and how people are one of the big things that are cost in that regard. And that sounds like it's a heavy book. It isn't. It is an absolute page turner. It is so fun. The characters are amazing. The art is incredible. One of the things that's really amazing about it is the fact that like the way that he draws the characters is like almost, this is an oversimplification, but kind of almost like chibi versions of them, where they're kind of cute, small versions of people. But then all of the rest of the art is like super detailed and like really dense. Like you look at here, I'm gonna hold this up, but the pages are just so full of detail. And like, that's just like a random page. And like, there is not a single, I don't know, there are no details left behind by this. This is like the type of thing you can just feel that it's a labor of love. And I love the cast. I love the story. I love the art. Frontier this was like one of those books where I should say it was the English version was published by Magnetic Press. It's one of those books that almost completely slipped by me, but I was like, I interviewed David Lopez, who does FML over at Dark Horse and previously done like Captain America and X-Men and stuff like that. And I was interviewing him and he mentioned this artist and I had to look him up. The only way to get this was through basically a order through the Kickstarter for this book, which was a really weird way to do it. And I was like, I don't even know this is going to make it in time, but I knew that I'd probably like it. And so I ended up getting it. And it was another one where I was just like, I have to read this. Like, I have to read this as fast as I possibly can. I could not read it in one sitting. It was too much. It's a giant book, but it is absolutely incredible. And it's also absolutely incredible that it is not my number 1. The reason why it's not my number 1, and this is a shocker. My number 1 is a manga series. It is Haraya Sumi by Kigo Shinzo. It is like the exact opposite of like everything I have said. it is not really sad. It's actually just like permanently heartwarming. It is like so lovely. It's about this guy named Hiroto Okuda he befriends this older woman who passes away, and he inherits this house, this like small home for him to live in. And it's just him working at this like weird fish pond in Tokyo, and his cousin moves in with him so she can go to art college. And it's just about them living together and living their lives. And like that is probably the worst sales job that has ever existed, because it is like, it sounds like no quote unquote plot to begin with, but it is just about reading about these characters living their lives and just you following them along and falling in love with everything that happens. Kigo Shinzo's art, I mean, Kigo Shinzo's everything in it is incredible, but his art in particular is just absolutely astonishing. Everything about it is gorgeous. It is some of the best looking comics I've seen in forever. It makes you feel good. Like, one of the funny things is there's actually a comic that the cartoonist made about why he made this comic. And it was at least in part because he got really sick right before the pandemic and was trapped in a hospital by himself for a very long time. And when he finally was able to leave during the pandemic and go home, when he left, he saw the world differently. And like, this is him trying to channel that feeling into a manga series. And Hiraya Sumi is like, I'm not gonna lie, Brandon, it was a pretty shitty year for me. It was a really tough year for me in a lot of different ways. And like, I needed something. I don't want to oversimplify it, make it just seem like this is like a balm for something that I needed or something. But this comic made me feel good when it almost felt impossible to do that at times. And I absolutely love it for it. Hiraya Sumi, spectacular comic. Not just one of my favorite comics of the year, one of my favorite comics ever. I cannot wait to read more.
Wow.
What is your number one?
My number one for the second year in a row is Batman and Superman World's Finest.
Ooh.
Mark Waid, Dan Mora. This is a book, like I mentioned, I keep track of how many issues are making my list or being thrown in the bin. And so 10 issues made it on my list this year.
How many were there?
12, I believe.
Okay.
So most issues made it, and the craziest part of it for me is the fifth dimensional imps usually are a no-go for me. I am not a fan of Batmite and Friends.
Yeah,
but they really handled them well here, and they made them enjoyable and fun. And then just overall, the art, Dan Mora's art is so incredible. Like, I'm so happy that he's moved over to Justice League Unlimited, but I'm going to miss him so much on Batman and Superman World's Finest. He makes that book so beautiful, and Mark Waid and him are such a great team. I think Mark Waid puts Dan Mora in perfect situations to shine. And yeah, it's just a gorgeous book to read and to look at.
I have not read it. I did pick up Justice League Unlimited. I've not read it because I was trying to go through all my massive pile, but they just feel like they fit conceptually. Like, Mark Waid is such a good superhero writer, but he's also so good at setting up artists. But then on top of it, Dan Mora, that guy, not only is he incredibly talented and amazing at drawing superheroes, he's also so fast. How does he draw so much? It's crazy.
I don't understand.
Yeah. I really need to check that out, because it seems like pretty much anybody who reads those books just has like this really great feeling about, like, I don't know, it feels like an ideal superhero comic in a lot of ways.
It is. It's not bogged down by a lot of the doom and gloom. It's a superhero book. It's real straightforward. What you see is what you get. It's just a lot of fun. And I think the world needs more of that.
Before we close, I want to revisit the question I asked. I asked, big two, is one standing out more for you? Do you find that DC is standing out more for you right now?
I find that more Marvel books made my list, but the DC books made it higher on my list.
Yes, yeah.
So quality wise, I think DC for me right now is just a smidge better in some degrees.
Yeah, I figured that's what you were saying earlier, because it's like Marvel has such high volume, but I feel like DC has this really high ceiling. I think a big part of it is like the art is so good. There's so many great artists working there right now. And then with like the absolute books with like Nick Dragata and Hayden Sherman, and you got Javier Rodriguez coming up, Rafa Sandoval. I feel like it's only getting better and better in terms of art. That's the thing for me with like the big shift for me this year for Marvel and DC is I'm only reading 5 Marvel comics right now. I'm reading the 4 Ultimate books, and I'm reading Fantastic Four. And that might change with One World Under Doom, because I think that's going to be a really great story. And Ryan North is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
No pun intended. But I feel like I'm going to be reading all the Absolute books. I'm reading several of the All In books. I just kind of feel like DC's kind of vibing. I'm vibing with DC a little bit more right now. And it's kind of interesting to see that after several years where I kind of feel like I was a heavy lean towards Marvel.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely been a shift. I don't love all the Absolute books, but I like what they're trying to do with it. I like the idea behind it. I like pushing in different directions. I like, that eventually these are going to collide. It just leaves a lot of cool, I don't know. There's a lot to be there. And the creative teams are phenomenal. Whether I like the book or not, the creative teams are phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, Brandon, that is all we have. Our top 20s are done. We're already preparing our spreadsheets for next year. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about our top 20 comics of the year and the year that wasn't comics. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I always enjoy it. It's a blast.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with my pal Brandon Burpee. You can find him on Instagram. As per usual, big thanks to Deanna Chapman for editing this week's episode. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketch at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketch on social media by following on Blue Sky and Instagram, or follow me on Blue Sky and Instagram. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Whisper, Chris Robinson, Brian, David Byrne, Milton Lawson, David Wilson, Joe, Benjamin Wilkins, Chris Hacker, John Neesmith, John Auerbach, Dustin Weaver, Ninja Assassin Love Story webcomic, Brandon Heyman, Aiden Hammond, Faith Aaron Hicks, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polges, Tom Evans, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian Holt, Near Levy, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tyne IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Ron B, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Klaus Vandeven, Submit Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashochi, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon Pills, Patrick Brower, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Liana Kangas, Nick Bennett, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Stephen Hole, Philip Myra, Chris Pachala, Torin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Walt's Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Yala Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, David Kelly, Jason Assey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nicole, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Carl McMahon, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. I'll put their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.